My name is Jessa Kay-Cruz, and I'm going to be talking about cover cropping for beneficial insects. I am the Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society. For those of you who don't know, the Xerces Society is a nonprofit group. We've been around for 50 years, and we work to protect biodiversity through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. As the title of my talk suggests, my portion of this webinar will be focused on beneficial insects, keeping in mind that there are lots of other above ground as well as below ground benefits to cover cropping. And Lauren, who's presenting directly after me, will be talking about some of those. I just provided a brief outline just so people have a sense of what I will be trying to cover today. I'm going to be starting out by just talking about the role of habitat in supporting beneficial insect populations, and also the ecosystem services those insect populations can provide to nearby cropped areas. I will go into a little bit about how to sort of design and manage cover crops and some tips for consideration, just based on my direct experience in different parts of California doing cover cropping work. I'll be sharing a little bit of monitoring data I have on insect populations in cover cropped areas. And then I will wrap up by leaving folks with a few additional resources. We will leave time after Lauren's talk for some Q&A on both of our talks or any subjects that comes up for anybody. So I want to start out by just defining a couple of terms that I use. The term beneficial insect, I've already used that term several times. When I use that term, what I'm really referring to are two very broad groups of insects that are sort of beneficial in the context mostly of agriculture in this case. So one of these groups of beneficial insects would be what I call the natural enemies of crop pests. So these would be insects like lacewings or lady beetles or parasitic wasps, insects like that that will attack crop pests, like aphid or whitefly or leaf bugs or, any other pest that might be attacking your crop. The other main group of beneficial insects that I'm referring to when I use that term would be the pollinators. Usually when I use the term pollinator, the first thing that comes to mind for folks are honeybees, which are obviously really important crop pollinators. But when I use the term, I really mean that more broadly. So including not only honeybees, but also the nearly 400 different species of native bees or bees that are native to California, as well as some of our other non-bee pollinators. So I do use that term very broadly. So I want to start by just talking about the importance of habitat specifically in supporting beneficial insect populations. There's a lot of data out there, and I did include some citations at the bottom of the slide, but there's a lot of data that really documents that the amount of natural habitat in our landscapes has a really direct influence on beneficial insect diversity and abundance. So there's this direct connection between beneficial insects and habitat. And I think what this means for folks who manage working lands is that by creating habitat, whether it's a cover crop or a hedgerow or some other type of habitat, you are playing a role in supporting these beneficial insect populations, many of which are really in severe decline. So, you're contributing to protecting in some ways these vulnerable insects. At the same time, these groups of beneficials, these pollinators and these natural enemies, obviously have the potential to significantly contribute ecosystem services to adjacent crops, obviously through pollination or through natural pest management. So I really like to think about creating on-farm habitat as a win-win for growers and insects as well. A little bit of background about insect ecology just to help understand the role of habitat. And when we're talking about cover cropping and specifically what we're really talking about are floral resources. When I think about creating insectary cover cropping, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about floral resources. They're really important to beneficial insects. Pollen and nectar make up 100% of a bee's diet. So obviously for bee pollinators, floral resources are critical. But other beneficial insects also rely on pollen or nectar, either at very specific times of their life cycle, or just to supplement their regular diet. So that, again, that's a real direct connection between floral resources and beneficial insects. And the goal really is to have an abundance of floral resources, really from the spring all the way into the fall, if possible. These different beneficial insect groups have different emergence times, sort of multiple generations per year in some cases. So the longer you can provide resources throughout the season and the more consistently, the more you'll be able to support these insect populations. It's also important just to keep in mind with any type of habitat work, whether it's cover cropping or something else, and you're thinking about really wanting to support beneficial insects, it's just the role of pesticides and really thinking about pesticide risk mitigation in all of these situations, recognizing that working lands or that pesticides are a really important tool in working lands. And it is not incompatible with habitat. Often it's just a matter of thinking about mitigating risk, whether that's through choosing a different product, applying it at a different time in a different way, or in the case of cover cropping, it could just be something as simple as mowing an area before spraying it to disperse pollinators and beneficials out of that area before something that's potentially toxic might be sprayed. So I won't be going into any details really on pesticides today. It's sort of a whole other separate talk in and of itself, but it's just important to keep that sort of in the back of your mind. I also want to make the point that there are obviously multiple benefits of cover cropping, right? I'm focused on beneficial insects and looking at, pollination services and integrated pest management. But, cover crops are obviously incredibly important in soil health. Lauren will be talking a little bit more about that. But whether it's soil nutrient availability, whether it's improving water infiltration, or soil organic matter, carbon sequestration, even weed suppression, there are many, many benefits to cover cropping that will really only just be touching the tip of the iceberg, I think, today. So in terms of designing and managing cover crops in California, I just want to share some things based on, about a decade, maybe a little over a decade's worth of experience that I have designing and planting and sort of helping farmers manage cover crops and all of these different cropping systems throughout the state. So, everything that I'll be sharing today is just sort of based on that experience. One of the biggest take homes for me, and I'll be going into each of these in a little more detail here, but one of the biggest ones was just taking into account the adjacent cropping systems, what some of the limitations and management may be of that cropping system and how that interacts with your cover crop. Really, at the end of the day, having very diverse seed mixes is generally what I recommend. You can, having really diverse mixes tends to give you a longer season bloom, and you can kind of hedge your bets because different species will just do well in different circumstances or different years. So that diversity is kind of protects you and helps ensure more success with establishment of cover cropping. And then also the other take home is including native species and the many benefits of including some native wildflowers in your cover crop seed mix. But talking just for a minute, focusing in on this question of cropping systems and sort of limitations or management strategies. One of the things that I found in doing a lot of these cover cropping projects in perennial cropping systems throughout California is that, all of these systems are a little bit different. So thinking about things like, is the area irrigated or not? Mostly we're talking about planting a cover crop sort of in these alleyways between your tree rows or vine rows. And those areas usually aren't irrigated, but it depends somewhat on the cropping system. A lack of irrigation is not at all a deal breaker, but it is going to influence what you plant and how you manage it. Other questions like, do you want permanent cover or do you want seasonal cover? Are you an almond grower, for example, who really needs to have a nice clean floor by midsummer for harvest? Or do you have a vineyard that has a lot of topography and is permanent cover actually desirable for erosion control, among other things? And then, other concerns. Are you concerned about frost and managing your cover crop to mitigate any risk of frost? Maybe you're a walnut grower and you have a lot of shade or heavy leaf litter. So just really thinking about your cropping system and what your goals are, how you manage it, and how that might interact with a cover crop. All good tips for success. If you are working in an annual cropping system, that's a whole I think layer of considerations and complexity. And, ironically, the biggest challenge for cover cropping in these sort of fresh market vegetable systems is that in California, in a lot of parts of the state, we don't really have a sort of a down season. We tend to go right from our warm season crops to our cool season crops without a lot of time in between. So if you are thinking about integrating cover cropping into that kind of system, you might be thinking about maybe not doing it on an annual basis, but doing it periodically and taking land out of production for a season to bolster up the soil or break pest or disease cycles. You might be thinking about doing something more like these insectary strips rather than cover cropping in a whole area. So these strips of cover crop that are sort of interspaced throughout your cropped area. Eric Brennan from ARS in Salinas has actually done a lot of work with looking at these kind of insectary strips. So anyway, there's just a lot of different ways to incorporate cover cropping. And sometimes it just requires a little bit of thinking outside the box. In terms of plant species selection, I just kind of want to share with you the sort of journey that I went through when I started working a lot on cover crops, again, with this lens of looking at how cover crops can support beneficial insects and pollinators. One of the things that I realized with a lot of the cover crops that were commonly being used is a lot of them were sort of, mono species cover crop plantings, which really provided a limited bloom season, right? One species, it blooms and then it's done. And a lot of these species, and when I say traditional, I'm talking about things like clover or veg or fava beans or maybe even grasses or mustards, things like that, are fairly commonly used in California cover crop systems. And so again, with only one species, once it blooms, it's done. You don't really have that long season bloom. The other thing I discovered in doing these plantings, especially back in the mid 2000s when we were in the middle of our really severe drought, is that these species are not always drought tolerant and don't always do well in non-irrigated systems. And then I guess the last thing would be, and this is probably most relevant to some of our native bee species, that our native wildflowers are what I like to call the ice cream plants for bees. So these are the ones that are really attractive to native bees. They've co-evolved with their native wildflower hosts. And so including those plants can be really important depending on what your goals are. So I started playing around with including native wildflowers in my cover crop seed mixes. And, what I found out through doing this is that their drought tolerance was really astounding and probably one of the most compelling reasons to include them. This cover crop that you see here in this photograph was a seed mix that I planted. I think it was like 2012. It was sort of the beginning of that 4 or 5 year drought that we had here in California. And only the native wildflowers germinated or persisted. I had some other things in the seed mix and none of the non-natives even germinated because we had such an incredibly dry year, the year that I put the cover crop down. But our native wildflowers actually did fine. And they were able to bloom, in some cases, pretty far into the summer. A lot of our native wildflowers sort of adapted to hold on to the moisture and actually bloom a little later in the season. So again, you have that sort of extended bloom season. This wildflower mix included, those ice cream plants for bees. So some of those native plants that are really, really good at supporting some of our native pollinators. And then the other thing that was kind of astounding about this project, and I found this to be true in other projects as well, is that, a lot of our native wildflowers are very good at reseeding on their own. This particular planting, I said I did it in the fall of 2012. And the last time I was at the site was probably maybe 2019, early 2020. We had never replanted the site and it still was going. It still looked almost like this, actually. The wildflowers reseeded extremely well on their own. So those are just some of the benefits of including native wildflowers in cover crop seed mixes. I do still like including a lot of these non-native species as well, because they also have some benefits. One of the greatest benefits, I think, of a lot of these non-native species is that they're just very fast to establish. And they tend to be pretty aggressive, which is usually really good because they're competing with, weedy vegetation. So they really help facilitate overall establishment. They often provide very valuable early season resources. I think I mentioned mustard before, but very few things bloom that early. And sometimes that's really beneficial to have that very early season pollen or nectar resource. And then cost is a big factor. They tend to be much less expensive than native wildflowers. So when you sort of include them in a mix, you can keep the cost down. And that's sort of where I am with cover cropping now. I've sort of engineered a lot of these diverse mixes of both native and non-native species combined. And I'll have some links to those specific seed mixes that I put together at the end of this presentation. I put this slide together of my all-stars, and I hate to do this in some cases because when people ask me like, oh, what are the best things to plant? I always want to say, well, it depends, like any good scientist, it depends on, where you are, what you want, your soil. There's so many factors. So I hesitated to do this, but people always ask anyway. So I went ahead and did it. So these are sort of my favorite plants to use in cover cropping. The top of the list is all native plant or native wildflowers by common name. The two that I put an asterisk next to are perennials. So in all the rest are annuals, but the asterisks are perennial plants in case that is something that, works in your particular situation. And then the bottom of the list here are all sort of the non-native cover crop species that I really like to use in insectary seed mixes. So then in terms of, so that's sort of a little bit about species selection. In terms of managing your cover crop, again, one of the things that I really recommend is trying to terminate it as late in the season as possible. Your idea is that you want to extend the bloom for as long as you can. So as long as you've got things blooming, let your cover crop go. Often I let things go until midsummer or even late summer, depending on where I am and what I've got in a seed mix. I guess the other big take home is that mowing is just such a good tool for managing cover crops on so many different levels. Mowing for weed control can be really beneficial, especially early season. We get a lot of kind of late winter, early spring weeds that pop up oftentimes before our cover crop species. So kind of hitting those with a high mow can knock the weeds down, but still protect the plants that you want to germinate. And that's mowing can be another really good technique for frost management. So if your cover crop gets taller or denser than you want it to, and you're worried about a frost, you can mow it down and reduce the frost risk a little bit. We do recommend for termination, we do recommend mowing as opposed to tilling just to minimize soil disturbance. And then I think I mentioned this earlier, but if you're in a situation where you feel like there's pesticides that you need to apply to your crops that could be toxic to pollinators or other beneficial insects, we do recommend mowing the area before you spray to just sort of disperse those insects out of the area so that you're not creating a sink. So that can be a really handy tool. I'm going to wind up here. We're talking, sharing some data with you. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the monitoring protocol that we used. It was something that we actually developed here at Xerces with input from a lot of our research partners. It's a very simple tool. It's used to assess populations of pollinators and natural enemies in habitat areas and compare those over time, either to baseline data or to control sites. The data that I'm going to share is based on this protocol, based on observational data collections, 3 different methods of observational data, but it doesn't involve catching insects or taking them back to a lab and keying them out to species. It just looks at these 8 different beneficial insect groups broadly that are easy to recognize through, observational data collection. And then these data were based on 2 years of collection and I think 6 different participating sites, all cover crop sites in different perennial cropping systems throughout California. The one caveat I do want to say is that even though I feel really good about this data and I feel like it's very solid, what we don't know is how this type of data collection might compare to more scientifically rigorous data, such as collecting and keying species out. So that is an important caveat because it's observational data. It's not something that I feel like would be publishable. Nonetheless, I want to share it with you because, like I said, I do feel like it's really solid. This is a chart of just the natural enemy populations. The blue bars are our cover cropped areas, and then the orange bars are either the control sites or baseline data, depending on the site. And then these are the 6 or 8 different insect groups that we looked at. And then this data slide includes all of the pollinators as well as the natural enemies. We just saw really large numbers of pollinators in comparison. That's why I broke it down into 2 different charts. But what you see at the end here in the total section is, again, the blue bar is the cover crop areas of all the areas and all the data combined. And then the orange bar here would be our controls or baseline data. So basically what that means is we ended up seeing 28 times the number of beneficial insects in these cover crop areas as compared to their control sites. So we know that this can really work. I'm going to wrap it up here so that Lauren has time to present and we have plenty of time for Q&A. I did include some links with some additional resources for general resources, as well as links to those cover crop mixes that I mentioned that I recommend. And then also some links if you're interested in cover cropping and you want technical support or financial support for doing that. There are a couple different resources and agencies that will provide that. So I am going to cut and paste this all into the chat box for folks. And I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks, Jessa. That was fascinating. 28 times the beneficial insects. That's really amazing. Okay, so am I sharing the correct screen? Can you see just my presentation? Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, so I'm a soil microbiologist, so we're kind of going to switch from the insects and sort of above ground impacts of these cover crops to some of the questions that we're asking regarding soil health and water dynamics. So I work in a water management research unit, and my station is located in Parlier, California. It's in the Central Valley of California. And so cover crops are fairly common in vineyards in California, but notably in the northern regions or coastal regions, and they're not as popular in table grapes or in the San Joaquin Valley, where we have really low precipitation. And one of the major sort of hesitations of growers in adopting cover crops is around water use. So there's a lot of concern over the amount of water it's going to take to establish and maintain a healthy cover. And so we had a couple questions we wanted to ask as we started a trial. One, in systems that are perennial, like orchards and vineyards, you're not planting into the soil where the cover was located. So some of those cover crop benefits associated with improved soil organic carbon and improved soil microbial biomass, are those benefits actually conferred to the zone of soil beneath the trees or the vines where most of the roots of your actual cash crop are located? So in our study, we looked always at soils under our cover crops in the sort of middle alleyways, and then also under our vines. because we want to know if some of the benefits of the cover crop are conferred to the vine row soils. And then we also ask a lot of questions around water. And so it might be a little counterintuitive, but there's reasons why we think cover crops can be of benefit to growers looking to save water. So logically, cover crops may require some irrigation. Like Jessa just shared with you, there are a lot that actually don't, and you can have drought-tolerant cover crops. But if you are concerned, they do take up soil moisture as they grow. And if you needed to supply irrigation inputs to get them established, of course, that's a cost to you in terms of your water budget. But there are also a lot of water savings when it comes to cover crops. So cover crops can shade the soil, so that reduces evaporation. They can also shade out weeds. So weeds that might become aggressive later and pull soil water from your plant root zones, they might be outcompeted by some of the cover crops. They also enhance water infiltration into soils, and this is really key. So if you're applying water to your soil via flood or drip irrigation systems, and you have a lot of ponding and that water is sitting on the top of the surface of the soil for a long time, you have a lot of water loss due to evaporation. So the quicker your water can infiltrate into the soil and be retained in that root zone, the more efficient your water use is in your system. And so that retention is sort of one of the last really important benefits of cover crops. So cover crops are basically incorporating carbon into soils in a variety of ways. You have the litter, which you might mow and it might decompose and serve as a mulch. You also have roots that die and decompose. And then really importantly, we have root exudates. And root exudates are critical to enhance soil microbial biomass. Our soil microbial populations contribute numerous beneficial functions for plant productivity, and that can help to improve nutrient and water retention in a soil and improve the capacity of the soil to sort of aggregate, and thus you have less compaction. So all of those things are considered to enhance fertility, but also contribute to water savings. So we received some funds from the Healthy Soils program, and we set up a experimental design where we wanted to look at both native species and introduced species in a table grape vineyard in the San Joaquin Valley. And so we were interested in the natives for a lot of the reasons Jessa mentioned, but basically if they've evolved for millennia with the soil microbes in this region, perhaps they also have interesting impacts on the soil microbiota, and maybe they're a little more drought tolerant as well. We also included a mix of introduced plant species so that we can compare an unmaintained bare control, and in our control we maintain that with herbicides, to treatments with an introduced and a native species. And so I should note that we did have a single species dominate in each of our mixtures. So we're really comparing a native mix that's mainly Tansy Facilia. That attracts a ton of bees. It's been really interesting. It has a low carbon nitrogen ratio, so it's been a great cover. And our introduced mix was really dominated by a Merced rye. So we're really comparing mainly a native Tansy Facilia to an introduced Merced rye. So just a little timeline, we established the cover crops in the fall of 2019. So their first year, they emerged in the fall, or in February, so early winter of 2020. And they grew to about a peak height around April in 2020. And that was the same year that we established our vines. And so in the about early spring of 2020, we put our blinds in place. And so around May, we have basically really dried out cover. These are both cool season species. And so they grow dominantly in the late fall and spring. And then around May, they're really dried up. They've reseeded. And so we mow them down. And most of the summer, when we're looking at our grapes and their productivity, we're actually looking at plots that look more like this. So the cover crop has been mowed and the impact of it on the soil at this point is more of a legacy impact or the impact of the mulch that we left in place after mowing. So one of the first things we noticed as we were monitoring this field site was that in the summer of 2020, those vines that were adjacent to where that native cover crop had been, they were consistently maintaining higher volumetric soil water content. So with the same amount of irrigation water supplied, the soil was staying more moist in those vines where the native cover crop had been. And so in this experiment, we have all of our treatments on different metered irrigation lines. So we started cutting back the amount of water we supplied to the native treatment. And then later in the year, we actually did the same to that introduced treatment. So we're trying as best as we can to keep all of the soil volumetric water content consistent. And we're doing that by tailoring the amount of time we supply irrigation water to all of our treatments. So when we looked at sort of our overall water use, we set up a ratio of that soil water content to the applied water. And so what we found is this blue line is our native treatment. And across the 2020 season, as we're irrigating, we had to apply less water to maintain similar soil water content in that native treatment. And that was statistically significantly different from our bare control. And then later in the season, we began to see some of the same benefits from our introduced treatment. So we wanted to know why, what was causing that. Usually cover crop benefits, especially when it comes to building soil carbon, these take many years to evolve. We did not expect to see a benefit in our first season. So we started looking at a lot of different soil properties that contribute to moisture retention. And we saw that there weren't differences in our total soil carbon at that point. Our total soil nitrogen was not consistently different. Moisture retention was similar, bulk density was similar. We also looked at the weed density in the different treatments. So if, for example, that Phacelia shaded out a ton of weeds, so you had less weeds withdrawing moisture during the summer, that could have contributed to this trend. But we did weed surveys where we looked at density and compositions of weeds, and we didn't see significant differences in our treatments. We're also monitoring greenhouse gas emissions. We saw they were pretty similar. There are some time points in the year where we have a little higher carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide emissions associated with one or both of the covers, but it's pretty small and it's limited to only that spring season where the cover is really growing. So here's where we saw a big difference. So we looked at our total soil microbial biomass. And so in this plot, we have extractions of our soil biomass, and we're looking at those numbers in our alleyway soils and in our vine row soils. And so the solid lines are our alley row soils where that native cover and the introduced cover are growing. And what we see is we start off with really similar biomass across all of our treatments before the cover had really grown. Then later in the spring, when we have peak cover growth, we do have enhanced soil microbial biomass under the alleyways in those in that Phacelia treatment. But we don't see that consistently throughout the summer, and that's because the alleyway soils become really dry. And so moisture is a major constraint on microbial biomass, and so throughout the summer, the soils are pretty dry, and we don't see a significant impact of treatment on our soil biomass. But the really interesting trend here is that we do see higher soil microbial biomass in the vine row soils. So these are soils that were just impacted by that cover being nearby. And some of that litter that's mowed and left in place, that can kind of fall into those vine rows as well. We didn't blow it there, but it may have accumulated there. And so specifically in that native treatment, we have higher soil microbial biomass across the growing season compared to our bare treatment. So we looked at some vine growth metrics as well. And again, our native treatment had higher vine vigor metrics for everything we measured. We looked at the number of shoots, the average shoot length, the trunk diameters, and in all cases, the vines where that native cover had been in place looked a little bit more vigorous and like they had healthier growth in that first year. So we wanted to look at our overall water trade-offs. And so in that first year, it was just as we were beginning this experiment, we had a really dry spring and late winter. We had almost no rain in February that year. So we were 63% of our average precipitation during the time where that cool season cover was growing. And we wanted to be sure we had treatments for the sake of our study. So we applied a lot of irrigation water and we got that really lush and dense cover. So per vine, we used about 156 gallons of water. So when we looked throughout the year about the water that we saved by reducing the irrigation timing to maintain consistent water content, we saved more water in that Phacelia dominant cover, the native treatment. We saved about 120 gallons of water per vine. And in the Merced rye, we saved about 56 gallons per vine. So we didn't make up for what we used. So in the following year, we were interested to say, maybe we didn't need to irrigate that heavy. So we only irrigated 3 times the following year. Of course, the following year was also a really dry year. So we had 71% of our average precipitation in the cool season of 2021. And we applied a lot less irrigation water. So we only applied 36 gallons of water per vine. So if you compare our 2020 cover to our 2021 cover, it's the 2020 cover is a lot more lush and dense. We had a lot more biomass than in 2021. However, in 2021, we still had cover that reseeded. We still attracted a ton of bees with the Phacelia, and we still had pretty large stands of cover. So then we looked at our soil microbial biomass. So basically we applied a lot less water, we had less plant biomass. Are we going to see a different impact on our soil microbial biomass? So what we saw in 2021 as we measured these factors across the season, in our native vine rows, we still had higher soil microbial biomass. This wasn't as stark, and this isn't a significant difference compared to the following year or the prior year, but it's a very similar trend. We also came in and measured aggregate stability in this year. And so we found that the native treatment resulted in enhanced water stable aggregates. So this is just the percent of the soil that is in a aggregate that's considered water stable and is larger than 2 millimeters. And so our native treatment has significantly greater aggregate stability. So we're seeing aggregate stability is often linked to microbial biomass. Microorganisms can produce glues and things that sort of hold soil particles together. And so we're certainly seeing a good soil health benefit of our native treatment, but the interesting thing is that we're seeing that benefit in the vine row soils as well. And so in this year, this past summer, basically we had really inconsistent growth in our vines. And that had to just do with a decision to top the vines earlier in the spring to follow a different pruning strategy. But this year we didn't have enough data to decide that we could scale back irrigation timings on any of our treatments. So throughout the summer of 2021, all of the vines were irrigated with the same quantity of water. But when we look across the season at the ratio of the soil water content to the applied water, we do see that both the native and introduced treatments had higher water than the control treatments, and that was statistically significant across the season. So some key takeaways from some of these early findings looking at cover crops as we establish a new table grape vineyard is that we pretty quickly observed a microbial community response to these cool season cover crops. But interestingly, we saw that response not just under the cover crops, but in the vine row soils as well. So this has positive implications for vineyard soil health. And even in dry years, so 2020 and 2021 were both dry years, cover crops were supplied irrigation water, but a good stand could be achieved with low inputs. And I should note that we don't have scientific data on this, but we do have an area of our plots where we just tested our strategy for seeding the cover crops. And we've never irrigated that area. And every year the cover crops grow and reseed there. And so even with no irrigation inputs, we could probably have some growth to our cover. And then cover crops resulted in vine soils that maintained higher soil moisture content. And so that's really ideal because there may be times of the year where it's more optimal to reserve water. So even if it takes some water to cover the establish the cover in the spring, in the summer, when water resources might be a little more constrained, we were saving water. And then another interesting trend that we'll see if we follow up when we actually have old enough vines to get yield. But we did see that vine vigor estimates positively responded to the native cover crop treatment. So we're really excited to see in our 3rd year of production, once we have harvestable grapes, if the grape quality or quantity is impacted by that treatment also. So I just wanted to give a quick thanks to the support for this project, which came from the CDFA Healthy Soils program. And many, many scientists have been involved in collecting this data. Margaret Fernando is a graduate student at Fresno State, and this is her master's work. And Natalie Scott and John Carlos are both researchers with USDA who have been very involved in this sample collection and data analyses. And we have a barcode, so if you need CCA credits, I'll leave this here so you can scan it, and then we can move to our Q&A.
Wow, that was great, Lauren. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to get us sort of through this Q&A. I'm going to field the questions as much as possible. There was a few that I did just type answers to while Lauren was talking. But then I got so intrigued with what Lauren was saying, I stopped reading the questions. So, but we've got about 15 minutes or a little more, so we can get through a lot of these. I think some of them are sort of in order of presentations. So I think I'm going to try to answer the first chunk of them and then turn them over to Lauren to answer some of the ones that are more related to her work. The first one is about, is there a best season to use cover crops in a backyard vegetable garden? And really, I would say it absolutely depends on what you're growing. But for most backyard vegetable production, I would say doing like a cool season cover crop is probably your best bet. To plant something in the fall and leave it through the spring and then terminate it in time for planting. The next question is, how well did the native wildflowers terminate for almond harvest? That's a really good question. So they're wanting to know, for almond growers who kind of need that bare floor, what was the experience with clearing the cover crops out of the way? For the most part, these cover crops just dried out on their own and didn't, we kind of selected, most of the plants we selected didn't have a ton of biomass. I think the main exception to that would be the mustard, but we try to use a dwarf mustard. For the most part, we were just able to mow, and then a lot of the duff just kind of disintegrated on its own because it was pretty dry. We did have one instance where a grower had a particularly dense sand on a wetter year. And I think that they had to actually push some of the debris out of the way. So it depends a little bit on the year and on what you plant, but I haven't heard any feedback saying that it was a big issue. Let's see. A question about mowing, wondering when is the best time to mow, again, sort of more in a backyard garden situation, although this is probably relevant for anybody. When is the best time to mow to avoid damaging eggs or larvae, insect larvae? So, I would say as late in the season as possible. At some point, your vegetation, especially if it's not irrigated, is going to dry up. So that would be the time to mow, or if you are in a place where you get a frost, wait to mow after your first frost. But, really doing it in the fall. Most insects go through some kind of a natural diapause period in the fall. So, that can protect them a little bit. And, also kind of on a more of a landscape scale, if you have other habitat in addition to cover crops, so if you've got, some kind of permanent habitat features, those will serve as nesting and overwintering sites as well. And then you can be less concerned about damaging eggs or, nesting insects in a cover crop area where you might be needing to mow. Let's see. Cost, deer resistant weeds, low profile because of fire or problems in the foothill. Yes, so cost is going to be variable. As I said, the native wildflowers are a little more expensive, but most of the ones that I focused in on are less expensive as far as the natives go. Deer resistance is really variable. I don't have good data on cover crop species and deer resistance. Outcompeting weeds is an issue always. The more you can control your weeds, manage your weeds, and get a handle on them before you plant, that's always my recommendations for that. Yeah, and fire is also always a concern. If you are able to keep irrigating your cover cropped areas in the summer, that will really help mitigate any kind of fire risk, because you've got, instead of dry vegetation, you've got greener vegetation. So yeah, I don't have a perfect answer, but those are all thoughts on that. Let's see. I think this is just a comment saying that they promote having a perennial cover crop that they can mow, which is naturally low growing. And so that, for some folks, especially if you're concerned, and this is really common, I think, in vineyards where there's frost concerns. And just incidentally, oh my God, Professor Gaudin at UC Davis has done some really interesting work on cover cropping and frost risk. And some of her early work shows that there really isn't as much of a concern or risk as people often perceive there to be, meaning that cover crops don't necessarily cause a situation where your crops are more likely to be damaged by frost. So that's, one thing to help alleviate that concern. But also, as this person suggests, planting things that are really low growing can be super helpful. And then having a perennial mix that can take a little bit of mowing is also good. And I think I had included yarrow in my mix of sort of all-star perennials, and that's one that's really good too, that will not complain when it's being mowed, tends to just come back very happily. Let's see, another question. Oh, so somebody had asked about suppliers for cover crops, and I put a list of folks. One of the things that's a little challenging is sometimes we're going to have to source from more than one supplier. Some suppliers specialize in native wildflowers, while others are much more likely to just have, sweet clovers and mustards. But there was somebody here at Buzz Cover Crop Seeds who mentioned that she does supply diverse organic certified cover crop seed mixes, which is great because that organic certification for the seeds for cover crops is very hard to find. So that is one place you can try, buzzcovercropseed.com. Let's see. Another question about comparing beneficial insects with cover crops versus control. Is the control bare ground or non-flowering cover? Okay, so that's a great question. So I think that was talking about my data collection. So what we started doing later is, I guess the control or the baseline data would be whatever is growing naturally in the same cropping system, some distance away, far enough away so that you're not having, spillover effect of your, insects that might be in the cover crop area. So, and usually that was, we tried to go a minimum. I think our minimum was like 500 or 600 feet away, but still within the same block. And so the question is, was it bare ground or was there other cover? And so it really depended on the orchard, and that made it, or the vineyard, because we did both orchards and vineyards. It really depended on what already was growing there and how they managed it. Generally speaking, it was a combination of either, it was usually sparsely vegetated ground with miscellaneous weeds. I think overall that's how I'd have to characterize it. Most people either mowed or sprayed those alleyways, but not necessarily obsessively. So it wasn't like completely bare ground, but there wasn't anything planted there. And it also wasn't like dense weeds, because most growers wouldn't really tolerate like dense weeds in those intercrop areas. So it was sort of, yeah, I'd say sparsely vegetated, miscellaneous common California weeds. Some of them were blooming and some of them were just grass weeds. So yeah, it's a really good question. A comment about using agrostis, a native grass, as a cover crop under walnuts, and a recommendation for that, saying that it was effective and tended to work really well. So that's a really good tip. And I haven't worked as much with grasses as I would like to. So I think that's a good one. Let's see. Oh, I think I might have just gone out of order. Try to scroll down. Okay, and I think that we are on to questions for Lauren. So Lauren, I think we're at Rebecca Sweet's question about measuring soil water in the vine row or the alley. I don't know if you can see where I am, but.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I do. Thanks. Yeah, so the question is around whether, when I talked about that soil water, the volumetric soil water content. So we have sensors in our vine rows and in the alleyways. When we're determining when to irrigate, we're using the sensors in the vine rows. And so when I'm talking about that soil water retention, I'm talking about the water retention in the vine rows. We do look at the alleyway soil moisture, and what we do see is that the cover is pulling a lot of water, and those alleyways are getting drier, especially leading into the summer. So that might be a concern or impact when you terminate, if you were going to plant an annual into that. But we don't really mind if our middles get really dry, because that's not what we're going to be irrigating during the summer. I think I'll just ask you this next question too. So the question is to Jessa: how many seeds per acre or row did you plant in your cover crops, and did you use a seed drill?
Oh, that's such a good question. And actually, after I answer it, I'd love to hear your answer too, Lauren, because so a couple of things. One is that I tended to engineer my seed mixes based on number of pure live seeds per square foot rather than pounds per acre. And the reason for that is that our wildflower seeds tend to be, a lot of our native wildflower seeds are very tiny and very light. So when you start talking about pounds per acre, it just sounds crazy to compare something like a yarrow seed to something like a mustard or radish seed, which is like, 10 times the size and much heavier and much more dense. So overall, with all of the different species combined, my seeding rates tended to be, for cover cropping, I would say between 30 and 40 pure live seeds per square foot. And if you go to that link I provided, you can kind of see the whole breakdown. But that, I think, is a good rule of thumb, and we found it an easier way to talk about seeding rates in these contexts. And then in terms of what we use to plant, that ended up in a lot of cases being the biggest challenge for a lot of the growers that I work with, is finding the right equipment. We used native seed drills when they're available, but they're often not, but they can be really good, but they do have to be designed to include native seeds, again, because native seeds are very tiny and you don't want to bury them very deep. We use a variety of different types of broadcasters, including ant bait spreaders, which a lot of orchards and vineyards already have, and they can be somewhat effectively used. But I would love to hear, Lauren, from you, what your seeding rates were, how you calculated that as well, and also what kind of equipment you used, or if you had similar challenges.
Sure. So we had a recommended rate of 30 pounds per acre, but I love your idea of focusing more on the number of seeds per acre versus the weight, because ours were really light. We went heavy. We did 35 pounds per acre because we only have a certain time to finish our project. So it's not an option to have a bad cover treatment in 1 year. So out of, I guess, paranoia, we went really heavy. And in the end, we had really dense stands where we had almost more monocultures, and that's probably a reflection of that high seeding rate. So I think that seeding rate was a little higher than we needed, and I think had we cut it back, we might have had more diversity in our mixes. And then we broadcast, and that worked pretty well. We had just prepared the vineyard for planting our vines. And so the seed beds were really light and fluffy. So it was pretty easy to broadcast and just cover the seeds in about a 1/2 inch of soil. I did consult a cover crop seeding expert, Leslie Miller, whose contact information I can leave in a follow-up email if anyone's interested. But he had a lot of great ideas and a lot of experience planting cover. So there are resources out there too if you're uncomfortable setting the seed on your own. Okay. So I'll kind of move on to some of the more of the questions. So there's another question from Rebecca Sweet who asked, did you rely on reseeding in 2021 or did you cultivate and reseed? So we allowed reseeding, and that worked great for both our stands. We did have some of the cover crops popping up in the vine rows, and so we just hit them with a herbicide once, and that was enough to knock them down. But the reseeding concerns might be different if you're not using herbicides or anything like that. You might not let reseeding occur. That way you have more control over the space that your cover crop occupies. And then, okay, so was the production on the grapevines the same despite the reduced water from 2020 to 2021? And so we don't have data on our grapevine production yet because we really only have harvest in the year 3 of our vines, and we only have the 2 years. And when we reduce the water from 2021 to 2020, that was mainly, we have micro sprinklers set up. So we're irrigating the middles to establish those cover crops. And so that's where we really reduced that amount of water. And so I hope that answers that question. And, okay. And then another question is it common for grape growers in the San Joaquin Valley to have overhead irrigation available? And so I think the most common irrigation systems here are probably drip and maybe still some furrow, but mostly drip. And so to set up our micro sprinklers, we just added another drip line, and then you have a sprinkler jet that has, a little bit larger than a 180-degree radius that you can point inwards. And you can just kind of set the pressure or buy ones that have the appropriate nozzle pressure so that you reach the middles. And it's questionable whether a grower would want to put in that kind of infrastructure. I guess that would depend on some of the benefits they're hoping to achieve from their cover. So again, we have an area where we planted our cover and didn't irrigate at all, and it does still come up each year. But for the sake of a research trial, we needed to ensure that we had the treatment. So we do irrigate for that. Okay, and then I think this question is kind of for both. So to what extent was the soil bed prepped or scarified prior to seeding the native wildflowers? And then how did you both irrigate the middles with cover crops? Yeah, I'm curious, Jessa, do you supply irrigation water to get those beautiful stands you have?
No, for the most part, we did not. I'm trying to think if there were any exceptions. I mean, we would have loved to if we could have, but almost all of the orchards that I worked in are now all on drip or micro spray, so nothing reaches the middle. I think for some of the vineyards, we were able to actually use their frost protection sprinklers in a few cases to irrigate sort of that middle part between the vines, but that's more the exception than the rule. So in general, no, we just relied on natural moisture and sowed the seed in the fall and prayed for rain.
Great. That's great. They're nice and like dense. Yeah, so we did irrigate our middles with the micro sprinklers, and then to prep our soil beds, we had already prepped our whole vineyard, but I did get the advice that you do want a real nice fluffy sort of seed bed before you put in your seeds, and then you can use a yarrow or something simple to just kind of cover the seeds after you've broadcast them. We did have a huge suite of birds. I'm not even sure where they came from, but they sort of ascended on our on our plots after we seeded. But they did very little because we still had quite a lot of plants pop up.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that too with the prep. The more that we could eradicate weeds prior to planting, the better our cover crops, fared. So we tried to really have like a whole season of good weed management. And then we also tried to disturb the soil as little as possible before planting. So just scratching it with a harrow as opposed to like tilling a whole area up. Again, just minimizing soil disturbance. To preserve the integrity of the soil and protect soil health, as well as to minimize just like pulling up, sometimes more disturbance equals more weeds. So just kind of scratching the surface of the soil just enough to get the seed down in there is kind of what we did. And then Lauren, it's a few minutes after 1. I know we talked about wanting to end promptly to respect people's time. Are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to reply to as many of these questions as I can. I know all attendees will be getting a follow-up email, and so I'll do my best to address any questions we didn't get to today, and that will come in a follow-up email, as well as the information again for CCA credits.
Yeah, and same for me. If people have questions related more to the insectary, above ground benefit side of things, please do follow up with me directly, and I will do my best to address questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them today. Every time I thought we were almost done, people just kept typing more. So I guess at some point we just have to call it good. So.
But thank you to the attendees for great questions and for your interest in the topic. And also feel free to reach out via email, lauren.hale@usda.gov if you have questions. And I'm sure Jessa is the same.
Yeah, and Jessa Kay-Cruz at Xerces.org if you have questions. And yeah, the big thank you to everyone who attended this webinar today. I know people are always very busy. And it was really great for Lauren and I to be able to share this hour with you to talk about cover crops. So yes, thank you everyone very much for attending.